on to introducing our next speaker, Susan Fitzy. Susan, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here today. Susan has worked in global trade for over 20 years, the last 11 of those at Otter Products, which you all probably know more commonly as OtterBox. At Otter, she currently manages the Global Compliance Department, which includes customs compliance, product compliance, and environmental compliance internationally. Prior to her current role, Susan managed the logistics department, overseeing the movement of product around the world, including the import and export into various countries such as the US, Canada, and the EU, as well as managing the freight forwarders and transportation of Otter's shipments. Prior to Otter, Susan was an international customs analyst at Payless Shoe Source, monitoring the import of products for stores in Latin America, as well as serving on a task force to set up new entities in that region. Welcome, Susan. Thank you again for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. I am going to share my screen here. Sorry, Zoom is not my normal platform, so let me make sure. One of the results of COVID is getting used to all of these new platforms like Zoom and WebEx and Teams and everything, and each one has slightly different modules for trying to set it all up. But okay, well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to talk about this topic. It's definitely one of my passions, and also just to give a little plug for all the students out there and what you're studying. There's never been a more interesting time to be studying international business. I got a master's degree in international business many, many decades ago and didn't have nearly the resources that you all have these days for learning about international business, such as presentations and forums like this. So I think it's a really exciting time to be studying it, and a lot going on in the world that impacts international business and global trade. So I'm going to talk to you today about global supply chain risk, vulnerability, and resilience as it exists out there for all of supply chain, and then also specifically for OtterBox, because we are not immune to all of those things going on in the world. So every risk and vulnerability that everybody else has faced, we have faced as well. But it really helps to be flexible and learn how to change and evolve with those changes. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've done at OtterBox to kind of roll along with all of the changes that are going on in the world. So we're going to talk a little bit about the paradigm shift that we've seen in the global supply chain and that the rest of the world has seen as well. Things were the same in terms of global supply chain for several decades, and then we experienced a lot of change in the last few years as a result of many things, including COVID, but lots of other things as well. So we'll talk about what that shift has included, and a lot of the factors that led up to the supply chain, causing the supply chain to need to shift and be more resilient and be more diversified. I'll also talk about some of the challenges and the risks that changing one's supply chain has, but the even higher risks of not changing one's supply chain and evolving with those global and geopolitical changes. We'll talk about the changing landscape, and then what Otter ourselves we have done over the past few years to sort of evolve with that changing landscape. And then, of course, I'll leave time for discussion, questions, anything that you want to discuss after we talk about this bit. So supply chain challenges. I would say that we have seen more changes in the global supply chain in the last 3 years than we saw in the 3 decades before that. So things changed. We faced challenges in the supply chain to a small extent before 2020. We'd see certain things like all of our eggs in one basket in terms of sourcing our raw materials, and maybe something happening to that raw material source. So facing some challenges there. We'd see natural disasters that would affect the global supply chain temporarily. we'd see increasing wages somewhat impact our supply chain. So smaller things that weren't on a global scale, but that started giving us clues that we as a country, and as a company, needed to sort of diversify our supply chains because these risks were not going to go away. But for several decades, starting in the 1980s, US importers put basically all of their eggs in one basket and were not widely diversified. China started building up a very Western friendly manufacturing base that made it very easy for Western importers, specifically from the US, to manufacture our product there. Labor was pretty inexpensive. And China invested a lot of money in infrastructure and developing industries that were very favorable for the US to import from. So they developed ports, airports, ocean ports, roadways to make it easy to get one's product from the manufacturer, wherever they might be in China, to those ports so we could easily ship them out. It was very fast transit time. There were multiple sailings, multiple flights. There's flights practically every hour, so it's very easy to airlift one's product from China to the United States. There's many ocean sailings, and so they really made it easy for us to manufacture our product there. And we kind of had this joke at OtterBox where we just marveled at how responsive our vendors are in China. And we said that they know what we need before we even realized that we needed it, and would tell us that that's what we needed. So we developed these very strong partnerships with our Chinese manufacturers that they could anticipate our every need and address that. And it's particularly important at OtterBox. We have what's called a very tight time to market. So that means that from the time in which we get the information we need to make our product, most those of you that aren't familiar with our product, the main thing that we make is plastic protective cases for handheld devices, so cell phones, tablets, things like that. So our biggest sales occur when there's a launch of a new device, such as a new Apple device, a new Samsung device, to a smaller extent, the other manufacturers of those devices. But that's when we sell most of our products. So we have this very narrow time to market of when we get the information we need to make our devices, where the ports are going to be, what the size of the screen is going to be, and we need it down to the fraction of a millimeter. We have to develop our tool in about 2 weeks, test the tool. During COVID, we had to ship our test product back and forth because we couldn't travel to China. And then we have to manufacture all our product, get it shipped over here, and get it on our supplier's shelf 2 weeks on our customers' shelves 2 weeks before this device ever launches, because what people do is they go pre-buy their devices and they want to have their case and their screen protector ready and waiting for when their device gets shipped to them. So all of it is a very tight window. So Chinese manufacturers were and are amazing at working at Mach speed to get us all of our product on time, so we didn't disappoint our customers. It's very important to our customers. A large part of their revenue is made from selling accessories and not the devices themselves. So our dependency on China and our collaboration with our Chinese partners was and is instrumental to our success. But there's several things that have happened over the last few years that have forced us to rethink our supply chain and also just the United States as a whole. One of I'd say the first thing that started happening is something that you may have heard of. It's called the Made in China 2025 initiative. And in 2015, the Chinese started heavily investing in 10 key sectors that they wanted to develop in China, with the end result being that they had this industry completely developed by 2025. Well, now that's less than 2 years away, 2025. But along with that China 2025 initiative went several things that are several initiatives that impacted US manufacturers that source from there. One of them is that China really wanted to develop a manufacturing base in a higher area of technology. As I mentioned, US companies very heavily relied on Chinese manufacturing, and that was in large part due to the low wage rate that exists in China. But China wanted to start developing industries that were higher wage rates, things such as like computer chips and higher tech industries where the wages are much higher. So they took their investment away from the areas, for example, that OtterBox manufactures in the lower wage plastic molding. So ours is definitely not considered a high tech type of product. So this China 2025 initiative was kind of the beginning of what I would call not the end of our reliance on China, but what drives US manufacturers to lean a little less towards China and start looking at new places to manufacture, because the very thing that led us to start manufacturing there was the low wages. And so keeping those labor rates down made it very affordable to manufacture in China, independent of the kind of the higher transportation costs of coming from there. That was far outweighed by the lower wages. Also, along with that initiative, China, as they invested in these different technologies, there was just some questioning around copyright infringement and taking US intellectual property. And the areas that they started to focus on were ones that were somewhat of a threat to US national security. So the US started to look at this more heavily and start to put our own initiatives in place to draw US manufacturers away from China and incentivize them to start manufacturing in locations outside of China. So one of the first initiatives that the US put in place are what are called Section 301 duties. And this was to disincentivize US manufacturers from manufacturing in China. Section 301 duties, if you're not familiar with those, was additional duties placed on product that's manufactured in China as a penalty for manufacturing product in China. So those duties could range anywhere from about 7.5% additional to about 25% additional. And the objective behind this was primarily to target the industries that were a threat to US national security should the Chinese have access to our intellectual property. So OtterBox doesn't really fall in that category in terms of national security threat. What we make is plastic molded cases primarily. So our intellectual property, while very important to us, is not considered a threat to international security. However, Section 301 duties did not really work out the way that they had been intended to. First of all, the industries that were targeted, the industries that they raised the duties on were ones that weren't a threat to international security, stuff like plastic or glass or things like that. And many of the industries that got an exemption from these additional duties are ones that arguably were a threat to international security of having that intellectual property, such as cell phones and computer chips and things like that, where duties were not increased in those areas. But the objective was to try to get US manufacturers to move their manufacturing out of China to places where that were more friendly to the US, where there was less of a national security threat. But companies can't respond quickly. Changing supply chains is very challenging. It's, as I mentioned earlier, China had built this whole very ideal environment for US manufacturing there with its infrastructure development and its manufacturing base, and there are things that are made in China where those industries don't exist anywhere else. So moving one's manufacturing base to a different country is very challenging for a number of reasons. One, because that manufacturing base doesn't exist in other countries. One of the first places that many manufacturers went to as a way to diversify outside of China was in other countries in Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. but that's very challenging because those manufacturing industries did not previously exist before a few years ago in those countries. So they had to be built from the ground up, largely by US companies. So for example, Apple moved some of its manufacturing from China over to Vietnam, but none of those industries existed before. So they had to build up those industries there in Vietnam where they didn't previously exist. The other thing that was a challenge was the infrastructure in those countries. As we ourselves started looking at manufacturing in Vietnam also, we'd look at which airport we wanted to ship our product out of. And we knew where our manufacturers were in Vietnam. So we looked at Ho Chi Minh and we looked at Hanoi. And for us, we analyzed it and we said, okay, well, it looks much cheaper if we were to fly out of Hanoi, for example, and that looks to be about 80 miles from where our manufacturers are located. So I would look at that. At the time I was in logistics, so I would analyze that and determine which airport we would go out of. And I saw, okay, 80 miles, that should take about an hour, maybe 2 hours to get to that airport. But then when our freight carriers would come back with the estimated transit time, they'd say, nope, that'll take 2 days. And I thought, 2 days, 80 miles in the United States, that would take an hour, maybe 2 hours to get to. But then as I learned more about Vietnam, I realized that there just was not the infrastructure. There was not a paved road going from our manufacturer where they were located to that airport. And that's why we needed to count for 2 days to get from there. So we were so spoiled in China with these freeways and these massive transit systems and the ease of transporting product from the manufacturer to the airport or ocean port. It just was all new to us and all the other manufacturers as well, that they just really, to be blunt, did not have the infrastructure to support all of the companies that were moving there. The other thing that we learned was that, I've talked about hourly flights out of China and multiple ocean sailings a day. Vietnam had maybe one flight a day, one ocean sailing a day, if that, out of their country to the airports that we needed to go to. So our product and everybody else's product would have to wait for several days. So the challenge, as we addressed those Section 301 duties and that deteriorating relationship with China from a geopolitical level, it was not easy. It's not easy moving our manufacturing away from China to other countries, even ones that are relatively close to China. The other challenge that started to kind of erode our relationship with building in things in China were the freight rates. As many of you probably heard during COVID, that freight rates were tripled, if not quadrupled. And you probably heard about the ocean port delays of months at a time trying to get one's product. And it really just was because factories were closing down in China because of COVID. So just the simple laws of supply and demand, one couldn't get their product very easily out of China. Those ports would close down because of COVID. The ocean sailings were packed. There were increased demand on ocean sailings because air freight rates were 10 times what they had been pre-COVID. So it just really created a huge challenge. So any manufacturing that was done outside of China was a lot more affordable during that crucial few months where it was where rates were at a peak like that. And actually, I should say it was a full year that rates were so high. So fortunately, a lot of that has been improved, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The next thing that started to erode quite a bit on driving manufacturers to leave China is human rights violations in China. Now, this is not to say that those hadn't existed for a long time before they started to be addressed a couple of years ago. Those violations have existed for a very long time. A lot of Western manufacturers just turned the other cheek. China and the United States are part of what's called the World Trade Organization. And if you've heard of the World Trade Organization, most countries in the world are a member of the World Trade Organization. And what is granted to all countries that are member of the World Trade Organization is a freer level of trade if those countries adhere to certain requirements. And some of those requirements include human rights. And so the United States grants what's called most favored nation status to any country that's a member of the World Trade Organization. Really, it would be easier to list the countries that aren't a member of the World Trade Organization. So basically, those rights are granted, that most favored nation status is granted to almost all the countries in the world. The only countries that really aren't a member are countries that with whom we don't do a lot of manufacturing or business with anyway: North Korea, Cuba, Afghanistan, the Sudan. Those are just to name a few. But China is one of the countries that is a member of the World Trade Organization. And so up until we imparted these Section 301 duties, these additional duties on product manufactured in China, and that started in 2018, we granted what's called most favored nation status to China, meaning that we would give them and every other country that's part of it the same duties as any other country that's also a member. And usually they set the cap of those duties at 20%. With extenuating circumstances, then you can increase those duties. For many, many years that China was a member of the World Trade Organization, various Western countries questioned their violation of human rights, specifically in the area of forced labor being like prison labor, child labor, things like that. And also minimum wage, living conditions, things like that. But human rights have become a lot more predominant in international trade. I think we just have a lot higher awareness for them now. And there are regulations that are being put in place on imports in the EU and the United States that will check supply chains to make sure that that supply chain is not in violation of human rights. CTPAT, which is Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, that's a government organization that exists as a partnership between US Customs and US importers to make sure that our supply chains are secure. One of the elements that they've added on this last year is they will check US supply chains that are members of CTPAT to make sure that we are not in violation of those human rights and that we can back that up and show that our manufacturers and our supply chain is responsibly sourcing and not sourcing from countries and from manufacturers that violate those human rights. And then the final thing that has really driven Western manufacturers to change their sourcing habits and where they source from, both from a country and from manufacturers, is sustainability. This has become even increasingly more important in the last couple of years. And I believe the person speaking after me will talk a lot more about that. But what I talk about will show you how intertwined in all of international business, including in supply chains, sustainability is going to become. And this includes things like responsible sourcing. So sourcing, you'll hear about or have probably heard about what's called ESG. That's environmental, social governance. Companies will be held responsible for where they source from. Are there resources that they use sustainable? Are they using materials that are made from recycled content? Or are they using materials that are recyclable themselves, or both of those things? Are they sourcing from places that are responsible, that are watching which materials and substances they use? The United States is going to increase its governance over what are called restricted substances. Lots of plastics and heavy metals are listed as we won't be allowed to import and use those anymore because of the impact they have on different things: human health, reproductive systems, endocrine systems, all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of materials that are very closely scrutinized now, initially by the EU and now by the United States, where we have to be very careful where we source our things from. Also, there will be new initiatives coming out in the United States for where our greenhouse gas emissions, not just as a company ourselves, but also our suppliers and our suppliers' suppliers. Starting in 2025, companies that make over a certain amount of revenue, for us, we don't fall into that, but we indirectly will fall into it. You might have heard of what are called scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for greenhouse gas emissions. So starting in 2025, much larger companies such as, Walmart, Apple, companies like that will be required to report out their greenhouse gas emissions, but not just theirs. They'll also be responsible for reporting out scope 3 emissions, which means their suppliers. So that means companies smaller like Otterbox and many other companies out there need to comply with their requirements of what their suppliers are. So all of these things are really, really driving change in supply chain. So where we used to sit comfortably and manufacture all of our product in China and airlift it from China, there's really a lot of changes that are going to be coming about. And it's not just COVID that drove those changes. It's all of these things I list above that. COVID really forced us to look at our supply chain differently and realize the risks we had by having all of our eggs in one basket. But it's really all of these other things that are forcing us to change those things as well. So diversifying our supply chain is what you are going to see in the coming years and have started to see already. And as I mentioned, it's a huge challenge finding these new sourcing partners and finding these new sourcing countries because of what China had to offer us. And it doesn't mean that we're going to take all of our supply chain out of China, or any other company is for that matter, but you will see maybe rather than 90% of one supply chain being in China and 10% diversification, you'll start to see the shift in the next couple of years. And you can just pick up any consumer product and look at the back of it in the next few years and see that it'll less and less say made in China on it and see it made in different countries besides China. So you'll see that shift to a decreasing reliance on China. But it'll be, as I'll talk about in just a bit, it's a very interesting phenomenon that we'll see going on right now, because where it might not be made in China, we will still have a very key partnership with Chinese manufacturers, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. So companies such as Otterbox are going to need to make a lot of changes to be more resilient. Catherine Tai, who's a U.S. trade representative, defined it very succinctly and made it easy to understand. If you think of supply chains sort of like investments, you've probably heard people tell you to not put all of your proverbial eggs in one basket and to not have all of your investments in one place. You might have a high rate of return if initially if you have all of your investments in one place, but you can definitely avoid or lower your risk if you diversify your investments. And it's the same thing for supply chain. If you diversify your supply chain, it might cost a little bit more, but you are going to lower your risks by quite a bit. So as Catherine Tai put it, she said, supply chain should be thought of as insurance policies. Spend a bit more, but reap the benefits when there are dramatic issues or changes, such as geopolitical events, natural disasters, or things that are out of our control. So if we look at it like an insurance policy, this diversification, the US manufacturers used to look at supply chains as where can we get our stuff the fastest and the cheapest? And of course, the answer to that was China, for all the reasons I mentioned before. But now she says we need to start looking at that differently. The objective shouldn't be for supply chains to get it the fastest and the cheapest. It should be to diversify. So it does cost a bit more to manufacture in other locations. It may not be the fastest, but it does create the most resilient supply chain to do that. So companies are starting to look in new places. I mentioned Vietnam. You might hear two terms or might have heard of two terms. One is called friendshoring and one is called nearshoring. Friendshoring is manufacturing in countries with whom we have a better relationship. You'll see companies expanding to places like I mentioned, like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, maybe India. Those are all friendshoring. So they're still far away from us, but we have a friendly relationship with all of those countries. You'll also hear the term nearshoring. Nearshoring means manufacturing closer to home, where specifically for OtterBox, that's Mexico. A lot of our manufacturing, as I'll talk about in a little bit, will be increasing in Mexico. We already have, and for many years, have manufactured in Mexico, but that was about 10 or 15% of our manufacturing base. That'll be changing a lot for us in the near future. So to develop this supply chain resilience, we really need to diversify where we manufacture. We also need to diversify and think about what can we make? What materials do we need to make things with that are more sustainable? What manufacturers should we be using that maybe are a little bit more environmentally friendly? What modes of transportation should we be using that are far more environmentally friendly than the current airlift methods that we're using? So we are going to see in the next few years a huge paradigm shift in supply chains, meaning where we used to focus on what was cheapest and what was fastest to what is the most resilient? How can we diversify? And in the end, maybe it will be the cheapest for us because all of our eggs won't be in that one basket. So we are starting to see this shift already. The U.S. trade deficit, we've had a trade deficit for forever, for a long, long time. But in the past year, the U.S. trade deficit was down over 20% for this same period in 2022. Our exports went up a little over a percentage point from what they were a year ago, and our imports went down almost 5%. So we're seeing this shift already. It's working slowly, this incentivization to take our supply chains out of China a little bit, increase our exports. But we actually, the US government has put the impetus on US importers to address this change by things like Section 301 duties and other things that would discourage us from manufacturing in China. But really, when it comes down to it, we also need the US government to incentivize us in different ways to manufacture close to home, whether that's here in the United States or locally. So as we realize that we need to address this change, as we realize as a country that we need to address this change, the US Department of Commerce set up an advisory committee on supply chain competitiveness to help the United States be more competitive in the supply chain, to help US manufacturers or US companies bring that manufacturing back to the United States or back to the Western Hemisphere. And so they've started talking about some of these things that would drive US competitiveness in the supply chain. What can we do to make you want to manufacture here is the question they've asked. And they've really said this time of relative calmness where there's not major disasters going on. And I know that's hard to realize with the events going on in Russia and Ukraine, the events most recently going on in Israel. It's hard to realize that this is a time of relative calmness. But again, that keyword being relative calmness. There's always going to be those events going on that are going to impact us. So it's relative calmness. Now is the time to develop and start rethinking the supply chain instead of waiting for a time of crisis and then thinking, oh, what can we do to fix that? How can we open up our ports better? What can we do to clear products more quickly and have the products get and cleared in the port more quickly? Let's talk about that now. So this advisory committee to the Department of Commerce recommended to the Commerce Secretary that she look in a number of areas that would increase US resilience in the supply chain. One of the ones that was the most critical to look at that would be completely upend the way we look at supply chain right now was how we look at what are called the rules of origin. And that might be a term that's not familiar to many of you. rules of origin are very critical. Rules of origin mean where our product is made. And the reason that's critical is because always before, the rules of origin have been defined by where does substantial transformation of your product take place? Where was it, where did it become what it is that we're importing? So for many companies, that's really, really challenging, because if you're looking at a computer, for example, you might have a computer chip that comes from China and a circuit board that comes from Indonesia, and the plastic components are molded in Mexico. And so where is that substantial transformation? And it takes entire departments and companies, you know, larger companies like Hewlett Packard and Apple and Dell and places like that, to do that analysis and that assessment of what is considered the country of origin or the substantial transformation of our product. The reason why this is really critical is because whatever country of origin one claims on their product is how they pay the duties for that product. So the duties can be duty free if you're making in a country where we have a free trade agreement, or it can be really, really high, like 25%, 40%, if those rules of origin are defined as being in China. So that is a really, really critical thing to focus on, is the rules of origin. Always before, we've defined it as where's that manufacturing process taking place. And by the way, you know, customs audits are done very frequently on companies. You can't just go out there and say, oh, well, we think our primary shift is done in Vietnam. And companies will do that to avoid paying those higher duty rates, even though it might have been in China where they're primarily manufacturing. Also, if one wants to use a free trade agreement, such as what used to be called NAFTA and is now called USMCA, customs will do audits to make sure that that product is in fact eligible to get that duty free. The reason this is critical, companies save millions of dollars by using free trade agreements or on the country of origin where their product is made. So whereas if you have duties that are 25% instead of 0%, that could, depending on how much you import, mean $25, $50 million annually for a company in savings, depending on where they manufacture it. So as the U.S. Department of Commerce Advisory Committee has called out, let's look differently at rules of origin. This is how it's historically worked, but what if we define it instead as this new concept of the totality of the manufacturing process? Meaning, okay, long before those cell phone cases are molded, before those computer chips are put together, there's some research and design and some engineering and development that goes into that. And that cost and that development is actually crucial for the low cost molding that happens later, maybe in Vietnam or China. So the reason why this is critical is for many years, U.S. has said, let's bring manufacturing back to the United States. But that would mean, bringing the steel industry back, bringing the footwear industry back, making things in the United States where labor is so expensive that we haven't made for decades. So there's no incentive to bring it back for manufacturers, because that's very, very expensive to use U.S. labor to manufacture something that is very low tech. But if we can define part of the manufacturing process as being that engineering and design work that went into making that product, then that is a huge amount of companies' investment in their product. So that means for Otterbox specifically, we have a whole 4-story building full of engineers that create our product. That would mean our product, instead of being considered country of origin China, is in fact considered country of origin United States, because all of our research and design goes on right here in Colorado, in Fort Collins. So that would be huge for us. So this suggestion by this advisory committee will have a major impact on a lot of companies going forward and on their supply chains. They've also proposed other things such as more automated systems in customs clearance. Can we do things with documents instead of paper? Can we use robotics to do the customs checks on the product coming in instead of opening up all of these pallets to see what's inside? Can we use computer imaging? Can we use robots instead of people? So all of this will be huge strides forward in terms of improving supply chain and making it easier for the US to bring supply chains back more regionally and more locally. Another thing that we're seeing is, as I'd mentioned before, a lot of these industries just simply did not exist in these other locations. So manufacturers were having to develop those industries in new locations on their own. Mexico, as of very recently, has identified 10 sectors that it is going to invest in to bring some manufacturing that didn't previously exist there. One of the most notable ones is lithium ion batteries. Prior to about a year ago, the only place really to source lithium ion batteries was China. And that made it very challenging because the duty rate on lithium ion batteries is very expensive. Obviously, there's a lot of conflicting type things that go into the manufacturing of those lithium ion batteries. The resources needed to make them are not sustainable. The process for making them is not sustainable. So, and the only place for companies such as Tesla or Apple was to get those out of China. With Mexico developing this industry in Mexico, that's huge. And that will have an impact on a lot of things. It will make it so that electric vehicles can be made in Mexico. And Mexico actually has the natural resources, that lithium resource, in a couple of their states to be able to source it all domestically. So we don't need to depend on other places with which US has more strained relationships for those resources. So that's huge. So Mexico is, and there's other sectors as well that Mexico is starting to attract foreign direct investment in, and that'll have a major impact and make it much cheaper for the US to get those products. Not just cheaper because of the proximity, but cheaper because of those duty rates. So that will be very important. Another thing that we're seeing happening in Mexico is US foreign direct investment in Mexico has always been, the United States has always been Mexico's highest foreign investor. We have invested heavily in the manufacturing sites there, what are called maquiladoras or IMEX locations. So US companies will go to Mexico manufacturing locations and set up a place to manufacture there in Mexico. Labor is cheaper there, and we can take advantage of the duty-free because of the free trade agreement and bring it back to the United States. Other countries that have invested heavily in Mexico to take advantage of that same area are Japan is another big one. Canada has invested heavily in Mexico. But what's very interesting to see right now is while we are all the heaviest investors there, the fastest growing foreign direct investor in Mexico is China. And this is very interesting because, as I mentioned before, the OtterBox has a very high dependency on our Chinese manufacturers. They know just what we need when we need it. They're very fast. So moving away from manufacturing in China is a big challenge for us. But if those Chinese manufacturers who we partner with, who we work with, who know our product very well, are investing in Mexico, then we still get that same advantage of them knowing exactly what we need, but we get to also take advantage of it now being manufactured in Mexico. So we have a free trade agreement and the proximity of Mexico to the US. So the transit costs will be much cheaper, obviously also much more environmentally friendly. So that phenomenon is happening. It'll be very interesting to see where this goes because the entire reasoning, as I mentioned at the beginning, of those Section 301 duties was to pull US reliance on China away from China and closer to home. And a big part of that was because national security threat and wanting to reduce our reliance on China. So while these products are being manufactured, and many manufacturers are doing the same thing, it's not just Otterbox. So there's going to be a lot of Chinese companies investing in Mexico. Mexico has a lot of requirements for foreign direct investors so that they can build their own manufacturing base. They have to employ Mexican workers. They have to have a joint venture with a Mexican company because the entire idea is, to help the Mexican economy, understandably so. So they would have these regulations in place. But as they draw Chinese investment here, it's interesting because it's not really fixing what we intended to fix in the first place, and that was to pull our manufacturing away from China because they're still going to be Chinese owned. But so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out and how that works. Another factor that we're all going to have to seriously consider in our supply chains is, as I mentioned before, the greenhouse gas emissions. There's huge greenhouse gas emissions airlifting product from China to the United States, which is what Otterbox has done and many other companies have done heavily in the past. It's about 1/50th the greenhouse gas emissions to truck 100 kilograms of product from Mexico than it is to airlift that product from China. So you'll see a huge, as you see this shift from China to Mexico, that will have very favorable consequences on greenhouse gas emissions in the form of transportation. So way fewer air shipments for us specifically as a company, but many other companies are doing this as well. So that'll be a very favorable change. Also, it will be much easier for companies to manage the greenhouse gas emissions of their partners in Mexico or in the United States than it was for us to manage that in China. We don't have any influence over those manufacturers in China. We can't put requirements on them to say you need to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, but we can do that when it's closer to home. Because we have free trade agreements and environmental requirements that go along with those free trade agreements. So this shift to more regional manufacturing and this supply chain paradigm shift will be very favorable for sustainability in the environment. Another thing that you're going to see a shift in is recycled content. A lot of plastics manufacturers right now, use what's called virgin material. We start all over with that material and source it. And obviously that's not very good for the environment. A couple statistics here, as you'll see this trend shift, 70% of millennials and Gen Z will pay more for a sustainable product than one that's not sustainable. 80% of consumers feel strongly that companies themselves should improve their environmental footprint. In other words, we should take it independent of US regulations or EU regulations. We should take it into our own hands to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, to increase our recycled content in our products, to increase the recyclability of our content, and ideally both of those things. 5% of consumers are willing to pay 5% more for products that are sustainable and environmentally friendly. And I suspect that percent will increase more and more over the coming years. So you will see that in supply chains more and more, this regional location for supply chains, bringing things closer to home, bringing the raw materials closer. We do what's called regional sourcing at Otterbox. So our raw materials, our resins, our colorants, if we're going to make them in Mexico, are going to come from North America. For those products that we make in China, those come from China. So we do regional sourcing to cut down on that transportation cost, but as a result, that also cuts down on our greenhouse gas emissions. So just really quickly to close out, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Otterbox has done specifically to address the the changes that we're seeing in the global supply chain, and to become a more resilient company, to not put all of our eggs in one basket and adjust to this paradigm shift that we're seeing. We are now willing to spend a bit more in our supply chain costs, because in the end, it's the best thing for us. It's the best thing for the consumer. So that picture in the upper left that you see of the watch bands, those are made out of the plastic part. There's a metal clasp, but the plastic part is made out of 100% reclaimed ocean plastics. So these plastics were pulled out of the ocean, turned into our resin, and made into watch bands. At a very minimum, our cases currently, 100% of our cases are currently made at a very minimum of 30% recycled content. Some of our cases are made out of as much as 90% recycled content. This is extremely tricky because we have quality requirements and drop test requirements and other requirements that we have to meet with our customers on the quality of that plastic resin. So when you recycle plastic, it loses that quality a little bit. So to be able to develop a plastic that's made at least partly or majority out of recycled content is extremely challenging. But all of our cases have reached that level of recycled content that still meet all of our drop test requirements and still meet all of our requirements for our customers in terms of durability. Additionally, our cases are recyclable, but that's a more challenging thing to address. The other thing that we've done to evolve with the changing global supply chain is differentiate our product and create new product. That product you see on the upper right is a new brand we have called Livery. We've had that brand for about 4 years now. It particularly took off during COVID. Our customers for this product are grocery delivery companies. Kroger is one of our biggest customers, and also meal kit companies. So what this product is a temperature controlled delivery container that's reusable. So in other words, companies that need to deliver product at a certain temperature level do not need to use refrigerated trucks for it. That makes it cheaper for them. It's also more environmentally friendly not to use a refrigerated truck. Also, these containers can be reusable up to about 150 to 200 times. So previously, those companies that now use our product had been using corrugated cardboard and dry ice. Dry ice, of course, is not sustainable. And those consumers then end up throwing those materials out. The program we have set up with our customers that use our Livery product, they deliver the product to the consumer removes the product, puts it in their refrigerator, puts it back out on their porch, and the companies such as Kroger or the meal kit company will pick these up and then send it through their reverse logistics to sanitize it and put it back into the system. So that has been a huge product for us specifically, and most particularly with COVID now that, and then even post-COVID, many consumers still want their groceries to be delivered. So a big area of opportunity there for us. The bottom product you see there is the newest area for us. This is what we call our industrial solutions. You can see this person is using a device with a lithium ion battery in a hazardous location. Our biggest customer for this is the oil and gas industry. Up until recently, the oil and gas industry, for obvious reasons, couldn't use lithium ion batteries out in the field because of the explosive nature of lithium ion batteries. And so they were using old-fashioned things like pencil and paper and things like that. Now these workers in this industry can use these devices that have lithium ion batteries, whether they're tablets or iPhones or whatever, because this case here has been UL certified and IECEX certified to be able to be used in an explosive environment, because it protects the device from that explosive environment and makes it so that it will not explode in that environment. So that's one of our newest products. The other major shift that we've made is where I mentioned at the beginning that we manufactured about 90% of our product in China up until recently. In the coming year, which is just a few months away, well over 50% of our product will be made in Mexico. We're opening up 5 new manufacturing sites in Mexico in the next few months. And the majority of our product will be coming out of Mexico starting in 2024. That's a huge shift for us. It took many, many years for us to get there because we started that shift several years ago. But this will be really important for our time to market, much faster transit time. It will be very important for environmentally speaking, much fewer greenhouse gas emissions by trucking our product rather than airlifting it, and then just a better relationship with that country. So just in closing, I would like to say for anybody who's out there majoring in international business, any young professional, international trade is not going away. We are going to have it even if we bring manufacturing to the US. It's changing rapidly, so it's very important to stay on top of all of those changes. Consumers are more conscientious than ever. They're paying more attention to where their product is coming from, what it's made of, if it's sustainable than they ever were before. The world is becoming increasingly more intertwined, and international conflicts matter. You have to stay on top of what's going on in the world because this impacts our relationships with those countries. It impacts global trade policy and it consequently impacts trade. So stay on top of those things, pay attention to what's going on, pay attention to where your product's made and what it's made of. You're entering a really, really interesting, important time in international trade and international business. So your timing is perfect. And now I'll open it up to discussion or questions.
Thank you, Susan. That was fantastic and extremely informative. We have a ton of questions, so I'm going to try to merge some together and address as many as possible. Starting with the most broad, I think, can you tell us what risk or vulnerability in supply chain are you most focused on going forward, or what do you think is the most significant that you're watching most closely currently?
I would say it's probably from a geopolitical level. We have very little control of what other countries decide to do. And so the one that's the biggest risk for us is the one of which we have the least control. And so I would say that having one supply chain dependent on a country with which we don't have the best relationships right now is probably the biggest risk. And we can mitigate that risk the most by diversifying and by manufacturing in countries with whom we have a better relationship.
Which is a perfect lead-in to my next question, which is around which other countries have you looked at as options for locating manufacturing? And I know you addressed some of them. And kind of tacking that together, what is Africa's anticipated role in the evolving landscape of supply chain?
Okay, yeah, those are great questions. Specifically, OtterBox looks in all countries for manufacturing, but not all countries are a possibility for us because those industries don't exist there, and we're not a big enough company to influence whether those industries exist there. So we wait for the companies like Apple or Dell or those bigger companies to go in and invest there so that we can start manufacturing there as well. We manufacture outside of China. We also manufacture product in Vietnam, Indonesia, Taiwan, and Mexico. And to a small extent, that livery product I showed you before is made in the United States. And then there was a second part to that question, Africa. Africa is a wealth of opportunity. And I think that is where everybody should be looking. However, I think we need to be careful because we don't want to do like we did with many other countries and take advantage of those natural resources. Africa doesn't have the human resources to protect its natural resources the way that other more developed countries do. So I hope that we all approach Africa with caution and not take advantage of those very prevalent natural resources they have, and that Africa is able to protect those natural resources and but at the same time develop its economy.
Nice. Yeah. So I'm going to move into the country of origin rules, and there is a question here about how much do the rules of origin determine where you locate your manufacturing, and I know you addressed part of that, which would be huge if it could now be considered U.S. country of origin. And I'm going to tack on my own question to this, which is, what do you actually think the probability of that going through is, considering if the U.S. government does change that law, that would be a huge decrease in tax and duty dollars for the U.S. government, which, would be, well, anyway, what do you think is the probability of that happening?
Yeah, that would be like huge for everybody. You're right, and that would have a major impact that they might have to consider. At the same time, it would help in the end the bigger picture. If the bigger picture is to keep that engineering and research here in the United States, and if that's what we want to do, it would incentivize all kinds of companies to make sure that that stays in the US. So I think that would be huge. The probability, well, the government doesn't do anything fast, I can tell you that. So the probability of it happening at all, I would say less than 50-50, maybe a 30% chance of that happening, and happening anytime soon. You know, I'm glad this advisory committee pushed on the Secretary of Commerce the importance of doing things in a time of relative calm, because we don't want to wait till it's too late. So in other words, encouraging her to make some key decisions in the next few months. But the US government does not do anything fast. So I'd say the probability of happening in the next couple of years is pretty low, of it happening at all, maybe 30%. But yeah, it would be really, really huge for many of us if it did.
I agree. Yeah. Okay, we're going to do just one more quick question because I know we're out of time, but do you think that businesses will support global international treaties for sustainable development so that countries like China will begin to focus on sustainability? Asking this as most countries did support the Montreal Protocol.
I hope so. And I think the person that's speaking out after me might also be, able to address that a lot as well. One of the shifts that I've seen, what was the first part of that question about China?
Really just, do you think that the businesses would support treaties for sustainable development so that countries like China will begin to focus on sustainability?
Okay. Yeah, I think what matters more than anything is money talks. So if US companies start pulling out of certain countries because they can produce more sustainably and sell their products more readily because they make things in other countries, and those countries are going to be forced to make the changes that are being required of them. The other phenomena I've seen happen in the last few years is we used to depend very heavily on the government making decisions about what was required. So, it's not required that we cut greenhouse gas emissions, so we're not going to do it. What I've seen the major companies in the US doing is operating independently of whatever our government regulations are. So the Walmarts, the Apples, all of those huge companies are, believe it or not, especially Walmart was the most surprising to me, but they have a very detailed sustainability initiative, and all of their suppliers are required to meet this initiative as well. And this is completely independent of any requirements that the US government is making. So they're going at it on their own. And the US is way behind, because we haven't signed on to many of those accords. So companies are going independently of that and just saying, forget it. These are the requirements that we're setting for our suppliers. Part of it is being driven by the EU because the EU has very, very stringent environmental requirements. Most big companies sell into the EU. So we need to comply with those requirements. And so companies independent of the US government requirements are doing that anyway.
Yeah.
Which I think is great.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Susan. It was fantastic, very informative. I know I didn't get to all of the questions, but for everybody who has outstanding questions still, we will try to get you some answers. And thank you again, Susan. Everybody is clapping. You just can't hear them. So they are clapping via the chat box.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it. And good luck in your future studies. It's a very interesting time, like I said, to be in international business.
Thank you.